Hi, my name is Mariah Mason, and this is my theory-based case presentation. I chose the second case, which is Rose is the client. And so I'll be telling you a little bit about her and her background and then kind of dive into some theories that I think would be helpful in looking at her treatment. So Rose is a 25-year-old Guatemalan female who lives in a city in Guatemala called Antigua. And she is now being approached by a social worker after being placed in the hospital due to a suicide attempt. Rose was born in a rural area of Guatemala in a small village to a family of farmers who would have to travel 25 miles to the nearest city to sell what they grew in their village. And Rose underwent some significant trauma 10 years earlier as a 15-year-old. She witnessed the murder of her parents by paramilitary troops, and she, her mother, and her sister were sexually assaulted by the perpetrators. Rose's trauma has recently resurfaced and been triggered due to seriously dating a man who wants to marry her. And this led to her suicide attempt. So let's talk about Rose's symptom picture. Rose is reporting feelings of depression, and she doesn't go into detail, but that could look like anything from fatigue to loss of interest in activities to just general feelings of sadness. She's also struggling with very intense thoughts of guilt and shame due to the traumatic incident and very intense flashbacks. And all of these symptoms combined that led to Rose's suicide attempt. So I wanted to talk a little bit about where Rose comes from because it helps understand and give context to what she's struggling with. In Guatemala, there is the highest concentration of indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere outside of Bolivia. And this is the group of people that Rose is a part of. And since 1954, these right-wing paramilitary death squads or soldiers that were the perpetrators of Rose's traumatic event have tortured and killed 200,000 people since overthrowing the government. Many of the people that were killed were politically active. They were activists, they were professors, but then there were people like Rose's parents who were just farmers who didn't have these strong political ideals or maybe weren't involved in politics, but unfortunately, the soldiers did not care. And unfortunately, the government, in trying to fight back against these revolutionaries, they have been destroying villages as part of a scorched earth policy to try and isolate them and stop them. And that has caused more poverty in Guatemala, which is a country that already struggles with poverty. So that's a little bit about where Rose comes from to give context about what happened to her. Rose describes her childhood as happy and very normal, especially in comparison to the other children in her village. They were all expected to go to school, but also help their family. And so, because of that, they had very long days because they would go to school during the day and then work on the farm at night. Rose liked being in school, especially Spanish literature. She loved reading and reported that she was the best reader in her class at the age of 14. But unfortunately, at that age, Rose had to leave school to work full time to help her family, to help support them on the farm. And it was around that time that these soldiers came to Rose's village, and things began to be tense between them and the men there. One night, Rose overheard her father having an argument with these soldiers. And the next day, they came back, and that's when the incident happened, and her parents were killed. After that, Rose left and went to the city of Antigua, where she had family, and began working in her uncle's grocery store, and has been in Antigua ever since. I wanted to talk a little bit about Rose's strengths because that's very important in a client assessment and evaluation. Rose is a very resilient person. There is no denying that. She's survived 10 years past an extremely traumatic incident, and that is no small thing. Maybe she hasn't coped with the trauma in the most healthy ways because she didn't have the tools, but she has survived and she's made it here. She also is very religious and has her Catholic faith and her faith in God that are a real anchor and strength to her. Rose has built a career for herself in the tourist industry, working in a shop, and it's amazing to see that she has been able to have this career despite the intense trauma that she experienced. And Rose has also been able to establish relationships and have that good social support in her community, working with vendors for her store and people that she sells to. So I wanted to first talk about narrative theory and why I think it would be good to consider for Rose's case. There are three key principles of narrative theory. The first is that people communicate about their lives through storytelling. The second is that people ascribe meaning to their experiences through the way they construct their stories. And the third is that people can adjust their understanding of the world by reauthorizing their stories. And I think this theory is very interesting because everyone has views and stories that they tell about themselves and their life stories. And by looking at them differently, we can completely change our mindset. There are some strengths to narrative theory, and that is that all cultures tell stories and all people of all ages tell stories. And so this is very applicable to a wide group of people. Sharing narratives can be very meaningful and help give people purpose, which is important when someone's experiencing trauma. And also, narrative theorists give you applications for working with clients who have experienced depression and for helping motivate social workers to be involved in social justice. Since Rose is a minority and a person of color, I think that that's very applicable to her. There are some limits though, because narrative theory is all about storytelling. Most of these studies done on it are in very small qualitative groups. And so because of that, it's not always recognized as evidence-based. And also because narrative theory doesn't label things in the typical way that the DSM would have you do, it's not always recognized as a medical model. So those are the limitations and strengths that you need to consider when looking at narrative theory. Some studies that I found that are applicable to Rose's case and show why narrative theory is important to consider is that narrative theory has been shown to help women with childhood trauma recover from it. And obviously, Rose falls into that category. Narrative theory can also help you with short-term exposure or short-term treatment for post-traumatic stress, which is something that Rose is definitely experiencing. She probably experienced it after the event, and she's experiencing it now, reliving it. And also by using narrative theory, memories that can cause someone to be very fearful and stressed can be monitored and for how people react and their emotions and their perceptions. And those can be analyzed and hopefully lessen over time as someone recounts that narrative. The second theory I wanted to look at for Rose's case is crisis theory. And crisis theory is for people who've experienced a crisis and are usually experiencing some kind of chronic stress as a result of that crisis. Crisis intervention moves quickly and seeks to improve functioning, which is something that Rose needs. She needs to improve that functioning that she has been really impaired by because of her depressive symptoms. And I don't know how long Rose can work with a social worker. So maybe she needs, a short-term intervention. There is a 7-stage model that can be used with crisis theory for crisis intervention, and it outlines the steps for assessment and intervention. And there's strengths of crisis theory, and that is that it's very flexible for cultural differences, which means that it can be adapted for all sorts of different clients, different ages and different backgrounds, which is great. Crisis theory is backed by a large amount of research. And but there are some limits because crisis theory can be kind of vague. There are a lot of modalities and methods that stem from crisis theory, some that are really popular and you've probably heard of, which I'll be talking about. But because of that, it can be difficult to assess, is it crisis theory that's really helping this client, or is it the modality that I'm using? Because it can be a pretty big umbrella with a lot of things falling under it. When looking at the research about crisis theory, one method or modality is solution-focused therapy that falls under the crisis theory umbrella. And I like this theory for Rose because it looks at solutions rather than fixing problems. Rose can't go back and stop what happened to her. And we do want to reduce that shame and guilt. And so we can find solutions moving forward to help her cope with those feelings and those flashbacks as she tries to move forward with her life. Another modality that falls under that crisis theory umbrella is cognitive behavioral therapy. And this has been shown to not only treat PTSD in the short term, but also manage it long term, because surely Rose will experience these symptoms again, will have flashbacks in the future. But what I like about crisis theory, and why this is what I would recommend to inform your practice with Rose and your intervention, is because there's a lot of different modalities that Rose could benefit from. I think she could really benefit from cognitive behavioral therapy and solution focused therapy to help her cope with her thoughts, to move forward, to find solutions, and give her that short term relief and help with her impaired functioning. So these are my references to our textbook and to the studies that I talked about. And overall, I really liked learning about Rose's case and having the opportunity to come up with theories that could inform how you would treat Rose. And though I don't know how it ended for her, I hope things ended well and she was able to move forward and cope with her trauma. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.